We're on chapter 14 of Mark today. So we jumped through a couple of chapters since last Sunday. We had the passage on the triumphal entry last Sunday, actually, in terms of our daily readings. So we are a little bit ahead of the actual so-called Christian calendar. But today is the Palm Sunday, and it is the official beginning of so-called the Passion Week of Christ. The word passion there is not like being passionate. It's a word that means suffering. So it's the week of Christ's suffering that leads to what we call the Good Friday, which is the day of crucifixion. So my encouragement to you is, especially this week, every day that you take time to read the portion on the daily Bible, and really meditate on the meaning of Christ's suffering for us. So we're on chapter 14, which is just 2 days before the Passover. So this would be something like Tuesday or Wednesday of our week, but we're a little bit ahead in that way. Chapter 14, verse 1. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her, but Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me, for you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. So in chapter 14, in the beginning, it is very clear now that Jesus is going towards that death. He himself says there's going to be a burial. This is not just a hint. This is not some hidden quotes. Now we have a pretty clear communication that Jesus is very close to giving his life as a ransom for many. And not only that, we now see the circumstance in which Jesus will be put to death. So in this passage, which is almost like a sandwich, right? You have meat in the middle, which is about a woman pouring perfume on the head and the body of Christ, which we'll get to soon. But on both sides, at the top and at the bottom, you have this idea of how to arrest Jesus, but do it in a way that will be a stealth, meaning it'll be hidden from the public. The chief priests are determined to kill Jesus, and the scribes along with them. And these are not only religious leaders of the time, but because the Jewish society, Jerusalem society, was very much a religious society at the core, they were the leaders of the community. They had some privileges given to them, even from the ruling Roman government, to do certain things to indict their own people and try them. They had a court called Sanhedrin, in which played an important role in the lives of the people in Jerusalem. So these were the people that were able to make very serious decisions about individual lives, and they had no ability to execute people. They shouldn't really. So they needed some kind of governmental involvement in order to execute Jesus. But at this point, they're trying to scheme this out. How can we kill this Jesus? The problem they see is the people, the big a crowd that gathered around Jesus who followed him, even in Jerusalem. And, you remember what happened on the day of the triumphal entry. So people were very excited about this prophet named Jesus of Nazareth. So even though they hated him, they wanted to get rid of him, they couldn't do it because, they were afraid of some kind of unrest. They say, lest there be an uproar from the people. And then here's a solution. And that solution comes from someone that really, if we didn't know the Bible, we would not expect. It actually comes from one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. The 12 disciples were with Jesus constantly for about 3 years. And it's hard to imagine that one of them would actually betray Christ. But that's exactly what happens. I know that many of you, including myself, are leaders in the church, even parents at home. That's a leadership. And oftentimes we struggle with the fact that we don't have comprehensive following from everyone that we minister to. All our children don't listen to us. I want you to know that Jesus suffered the same problem. Jesus being a master teacher, he's being really the Messiah, the Lord, yet one of the 12 that he so closely discipled turned out to be a flaw. This is hard to believe, but that's the reality. So Judas meets up with these leaders, and his suggestion is that I will hand Christ over to you by giving you a secret location that is known only to Christ and the disciples, us. We, the insiders, we know where he is in private times. And later on, that very private place happens to be a Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus often went with his disciples to pray. So the promise is that Judas will be given money. And we find out from Matthew that the money that he will be given is 30 pieces of silver, or 30 silver coins. And that number may actually be significant in today's sermon, but we'll hear about this. So, I'm going to share with you the people surrounding the events that we read about. So first group of people that I just want to mention is that, yes, the so-called the evil alliance of the religious leaders and Judas Iscariot. What's happening? What's motivating them? The second person that I will be talking about is the woman in the story, the woman, the anointer of Christ. And the third person that we'll talk about is Jesus Christ. So we'll go in that order, and I hope that somehow the passage will unfold very nicely in this way. Why did the religious leaders try to kill Jesus? What was going on in their hearts? What's the motivation? And you realize that this is actually coming from the passage we read last Sunday. The time when they determined to destroy Jesus is when Jesus cleansed the temple. Remember that event that we talked about last week, where Jesus entered into the Gentiles' court, and he chased out all the merchants there. And Jesus cried out. The Father said, "My house shall be the house of prayer for all nations." And that important Jeremiah passage he quotes, "But you have made it into a den of robbers." Remember, I mentioned that probably means, and circumstantially I think it makes a lot of sense, that there was financial fraud that was going on. There was cheating, there was extortion. The poor, especially the ones that could only give pigeons in sacrifice, even the poor were exploited by so-called the religious authority of the time, who gave these merchants special permission to use the temple ground to do these transactions. Jesus chased them out, and it's that very moment. If I may take you back to chapter 11, verse 18, the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him. What did they hear? Well, they heard what Jesus said. You have turned this into a den of robbers. And it says they feared him because all the crowd were astonished at his teaching. The fear is not about Jesus. What's the fear? Okay, so we're going to just break this down a little bit, and I got to do this rather quickly. And I think first is, very, very unfortunately, and this is not uncommon in the world today, the motivation for them is money. It's hard to believe that people could do such a horrible thing like killing an innocent man for the sake of money, but I think people do all kinds of things to preserve their status quo. People do all kinds of things that are very unkindly to humanity in order that they may keep the money that they have, or to keep the money keep on coming to them. No wonder Jesus said you cannot serve God and mammon. Mammon is word for money at the same time. You can't serve both. For many people, money is their God. Yes, the Pharisees loved money, the Bible says. The leaders had this kind of secret alliance by which this conspiracy that they were bringing in a lot of income to themselves. And what Jesus did was a destruction to that system of financial gain. And they were extremely, extremely upset, to a point where they decided to kill Jesus. The other reason is that they were afraid. What were they afraid of? Were they afraid of the people per se? No. Were they afraid of the truth that Jesus was talking about? Not even. What were they afraid of? They were afraid of the loss that could come. The loss of what? Loss of their own little kingdom. They're the rulers. They're the ones who call the shots. They're the ones who make things happen. They have control over the situation. And they are scared that this Jesus is going to rock the boat, that this Jesus will appear, and he did, and he will shake the foundation of their little kingdoms. This kind of, these motivations are not uncommon, is it really, in our world today, that people do things for money and people do things for honor and control. How about Judas Iscariot? Is he any different? It's very interesting that even among so-called believers, should I say even inside the church, you have a very similar bitter root that's growing. And here's Judas Iscariot. You know what? Mark is really not at all kind to this man. I mean, nobody should be kind to Judas really for what he's done, but Mark especially is very plain about recording about Judah. There's no record at all about what happens after. You know that Judas, Judas actually was filled with remorse, and he literally took his own life as a result of that. Mark doesn't talk about that at all. This is it. What happens on Mount Gethsemane when he kisses Jesus to identify that this is the man in the midst of a dark night. So that the mob that has come from the high priest and the scribe would arrest him, betraying his master with that kiss. That's Judas, and there's no explanation of any sort other than the fact that, yes, he did it. Why? Because of money, 30 pieces of silver. And then he did it. Why? Because, yes, like many of us, he was hungry for control. I think he was not happy with what Jesus is doing. I think that's one motivation that we can pick up. He's not happy when Jesus talks about dying. He followed Jesus for 3 years. He feels like his life is a waste, and he needs to take control. What does he do? Well, Jesus, look what I can do. I can take control of the situation, and I could even bring you to death. This is very sick and distasteful, so-called the pleasure psychology of criminals. The criminals who do what they determine to do. They execute people in their own manner because it gives them a pleasure of control. And I think Judas is like that as well. You know, when I think about it, these people's lives probably were filled with all kinds of rationalizations and all kinds of contents of various kinds. You know, these leaders, I'm sure they could come up with millions of reasons why Jesus has to die. They probably wanted to talk about what it means to keep the order of the nation that they had, how to keep the integrity of the temple. All these words about keeping the order, keeping the integrity, keeping things in the way that it should be. They have all kinds of reasons to talk about, I'm sure, but really, please, at the heart, what are they doing? They're trying to keep their food keep on coming to their table. This is selfishly motivated. It's a motivation for their own little kingdom that they can manage and control. This is a huge challenge for us, brothers and sisters, because I think we can really be motivated the same way. If there are any of us who has ever made a decision, whether it's a financial decision or decision of any kind of management of the life that we have or the institutions that we run, if we do anything that's motivated by the service of God, a service of money as God, or service of our own self-interest, service of our own kingdom to maintain our own sense of control, if all those things are basically motivating us, then I think we need to seriously look into the meaning of the gospel all over again. Because I don't think the Lord is calling us to a life of that kind. The Lord is calling us to a very different kind of life where we give ourselves rather than we take. How do we give ourselves? That's really a big question. Now the second person, first was a group of people, now the second person is the woman who anointed Jesus. And what a contrast you have in this woman's action. It's a huge contrast from the religious leaders and Judas Iscariot. And I think we could put it in such a way that the contrast is very, very specific. I think there is a good reason why the story of this evil alliance is put in the front and the back of this story in the middle. It's to show you the darkness and the light. The story in the middle comes out as light. And even within that story, that argument, why didn't we save money? Why didn't we do this in a way that we could control the fund? Comes out. It's a reminder of what's going on in the overall story. What about the woman? Well, first of all, she's done something that is hard to understand from an average mind. She has made an incredible so-called a financial sacrifice here. That's immediately noticed. What's going on? Well, Jesus is reclining and he's in this person's house, reclining meaning that he's in the time of meal. And this woman comes and what does she have? Well, she has an alabaster a flask. I think maybe a better way to put it is like a sealed box. You know, alabaster is a very hard, semi-clear stone, right? It's a very precious stone. It still would be considered a precious stone today, but I'm sure it was even more then. But really, it's not just the alabaster box that was precious. What was in it was more precious, right? She came with an alabaster flask of ointment. I think better word would be a perfume. It was a very beautifully smelling a perfume or ointment, but it was not a very cheap perfume. You know, it's not something you could get for $100. This was a very, very expensive, very costly perfume. And it says it's an ointment of pure nard. The word nard, that's an English word, I suppose, but it actually is a transliteration of the Greek word nardos, which is a very specific kind of plant. And out of this plant's root, you squeeze it and you extract out of the root this very special anointment. And it said it's the pure nard. So it was not mixed with water. It was not mixed with anything. It was a pure nard, 100% nard, nardos. And it was an authentic thing that was placed inside a very precious box. And that box was, I'm sure, very tightly sealed. Why? Because, well, it's the smell that you don't want to escape from that box. Everybody knew what that was. So this woman comes and she broke the flask. And that word is not easy to understand. What does that exactly mean? But I think the intention of the writer is that what she did made it impossible to go back. She broke it. She unsealed it. There was some kind of damage done to the box itself that there was no way that she could undo this. Now, the pure nard, that very costly ointment is going to be absolutely spent and poured it over his head. Head anointing is a very sacred thing, but in this case, I think the idea is not only to anoint his head, but his entire body. Just let the perfume just saturate Jesus. What was the response? People began to become angry. It says they were indignant. And in fact, I think that's why you need to read other Gospels too. In John, for example, that disciple that's identified, the one who got really angry, it was Judas Iscariot. Judas was the one who was really angry. And the words were something like, why was this so wasted? We could have sold it for 300 denarii, and when needed, we could have given it to the poor. Great excuse. Again, remember what I said? There's all kinds of reasons why you do what you do, even though the motivation is very evil. And John, in his gospel, is very specific. He says, well, that's not because Judas cared for the poor. You could go there one day, later, and read it yourself. It basically says, well, because he was a thief. Which means that he casually took money from the treasury among the disciples. He kept the money back, and he used it at his own liberty because he was a thief. His heart was given to robbery, thievery. He's one of those that contributed to that den of robbers scenario. He was no different, even though he was one of the insiders. It could have been sold for 300 denarii. You may be curious about the value of that in today's term. Basically, 1 denarius, a Roman silver coin, at the time is equivalent to 1 day wage of a skilled worker. So this is not in today's term, it's not a basic wage, but it's an average wage for the people who have skilled jobs, whatever that may be. I'm sure even that there's a lot of variety of how much people make. But 300 of this means that this is 1 year's wage, right? It's not hard to calculate. So 1 year's wage, 300 silver coins. Remember I said, well, keep in mind the 30 silver coins that Judas received. And here we have 300 silver coins. Judas was very quick. He calculated this very quickly. What is it? Well, tens of thousands of dollars. Well, let's call it $100,000. It depends on what job you have, how much you make a year. But in America, I don't think that's very unusual for a very skilled worker to make $100,000. So let's imagine, here's a woman who's basically poured out in one action on this man's head $100,000 worth of perfume. The question is, what is your response to that? What is your response? Maybe our response is very similar. Wow, that's a lot of money. Maybe we're good enough to say, well, yeah, I guess it's worth it, but boy, she really gave a lot here. It's like thinking about a major financial donation, what would make it to a good cause, and you would say, wow, $100,000 for that cause, one person, that's a lot of money. And you might say, wow, we really need to applaud for this person's commitment or sacrifice. But I think here's a very important thing, what Jesus said about it. Jesus said, don't trouble her, because she has done a beautiful thing to me, a beautiful thing. In other words, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. She's done something that's good. And secondly, it's not about the poor, because you have poor among you all the time, but I will not be with you all the time, meaning that not only was it a good action, this was a timely action. Verse 8 says, she has done what she could, which means she's done to the utmost of her ability. She gave her all. So this was not only a good action, not only a timely action, this was a very heart-filled action. Well, that's all good. That's all good, right? For the reason alone? But no. I want you to see the fact that what Jesus says is not just that these were good action, this was a good action, this was a timely action, that this was her heartfelt and heart-filled action, but really what's important here is that in all these three things or three ways Jesus describes it, it's all about Jesus. She's done a beautiful thing to me. This is not about the poor, but it's about me. She gave all that she had, what? For the preparation of my burial. It's about me. That's a good thing we need to know. You know why? Because if we focus on this woman's sacrifice, if we focus on the amount of the money and how much it is that she had poured out on Jesus, then you lose the point. You actually lose the focus. The focus is not the money here, but the focus is Jesus. What does that mean? Well, that means if Jesus is somebody who is precious to you, if Jesus is someone who obviously is worth far more than $100,000 to you, you would do it, never feeling like this is a huge sacrifice on my part. You do it because it proportionally makes sense. That's the only reason. But she did it. She was not angry at the value of the perfume. She was not impressed by her own action, that she was giving so much. She was not just deeply moved by her own ability to give such a commitment to Jesus. Because the focus was not there. The focus was on Jesus. Jesus got it right. She was able to do it not because she focused on her commitment, but because she focused on Jesus. This is hard to do in a pragmatic society that we have, because I think we have a very Western mindset in our pragmatism, which says whatever service you do must be compensated. If you do something that's not compensated, well, that's not worth it. So they will question your motive. You must be compensated some way. You know, that whole compensation mentality works in all many different areas. For example, if you're working for money, that's what you do. You work at 7-Eleven or McDonald's or Wawa. You work for money. But when you are serving God, well, in fact, all your work should be serving God. But if your heart is really motivated to do what is pleasing to God, if you're doing it for Jesus, then no longer is it a compensation issue. It's an issue of who Jesus is to your heart. You know, I think about how Jubilee even gets to be where we are. I think this is not because we were, from the very beginning, fair for compensating everybody. As a church planter, there was no money. There was no compensation that sounded fair. We had to live with very, very minimum to begin with. We had to work outside the church in order to make a living. But we did it. Why? Not because we were so impressed by our own commitment, not because we were so impressed by how much sacrifice we were making, but because we saw the cause. We saw that this is for Jesus Christ and the body. And we had this sense of call, that Jesus is calling us to do this. We did it not for the sake of compensation. We did it because this was the way that we give ourselves to Christ. Why can't people understand that? Why can't people understand that? Why is it? Even pastors. I think at the Western mind, you go to the very depth of it, and you will always hear people say, well, am I fairly compensated? Only way you can understand this is when you have Jesus as the focus. So again, this woman, very different from the others that we heard about already, right? This woman was not looking at money, number one, and this woman was not looking at herself. Not even her commitment, not even her sacrifice, not even her piety. Remember, Jesus hated it. Jesus despised the people who made piety even a reason for self-glory. Remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. Do not pray like these Pharisees. Do not pray like them, because they pray in order that people may hear what they do, and they themselves will gain glory and honor for being such great religionists. That's exactly what's wrong with the religions today. Religion becomes a way to make you look better. The center is the woman. The center is the woman. It's a total surrender. But again, what's really tricky here is that you don't want to focus on surrender issue. Don't worry so much about what that sacrifice is. As long as you are focused on what you do, how much you sacrificed, how much you worked, how hard you worked at something. I've given all this. What do I get for this? As long as you focus on that, even if you think you're doing it for the Lord, that's the wrong motivation. You need to focus on Christ, or else nothing makes sense, really, because Jesus does not ask for your time. Jesus does not ask for your labor. Jesus doesn't even ask for your talent. Well, he does, but at the heart, yes, at the heart, Jesus asks for your heart. Do it. Love the Lord with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. This is not things you do. This is your entire self given to God, or else it makes no sense. Finally, we come to Jesus. How about Jesus? Why is this so much here? Every narrative has a point, right? Why is it here, right here, smack in the midst of this very important course of events in that last week of Jesus? Because this story is about Jesus. Well, let me put it this way. Remember what Jesus said? On verse 9, truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. So here are two parts. Wherever the gospel is proclaimed, this story will be relevant. And also there's something about in memory of her. Well, we'll get to that second part soon. But the first part, this story has something to do with the gospel. And what is the gospel? Gospel is Jesus giving his life as a ransom for many. And what is Jesus doing? Well, I'm going to bring that out that expression again, that term, prophetic drama. Jesus didn't take this simply as a woman's sacrifice. Jesus took this as a redemptive, prophetic drama. What she did represents what Christ did, or Christ does. In fact, that alabaster box that was broken, out of which the pure nard, the absolutely valuable thing, poured out into the life of somebody. This very act being broken, being poured, being emptied out is Jesus. The reason why what she did will be told along with the gospel is because that's the gospel. People didn't understand it. They said, what a waste. Exactly. Oh, Jesus, what a waste. What a waste if you look at it from the point of view of the other. Remember what Romans 5 says. Jesus died on the cross when we were still weak and valueless. Jesus died on the cross when we were still sinning against Jesus. Jesus died on the cross when we were enemies of Him. Senseless, absolute waste. There's no reason why you should do any of this. Jesus, what are you doing? Why are you doing what you're doing? But Jesus is pouring out His life, yes, in the eyes of the world as a waste. Oh, what a waste. But He does it. For what? To save the world. We will soon get to that point, next verse 12, about the Passover. How Jesus eats the Passover meal with the disciples. Jesus is the Passover lamb. And what is a Passover lamb? Well, you got to go back to the Exodus story when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt, and that final plague of the 10 plagues is the killing of the eldest. And that very night, when the angel of death would sweep through the land of Egypt, that very night, the Israelites are spared, they're saved. How are they saved? Well, they follow the direction. And the direction is they must take a lamb, an unblemished lamb, a cute little lamb. They must take it into their own house. And that lamb must remain in the house for 5 days. So you have to actually live with this lamb. And then the day of the so-called Passover, at the time of dusk, what they have to do is they have to slay this lamb. What trauma that must be to kill the lamb at that moment, especially if they had little children at home. And this was a time when they were living among these household animals, and they were not necessarily pets, but you could imagine these little ones loving this lamb so much, unblemished lamb, to a point where they think of this lamb as a member of their own family. But they must kill it. They must drain the blood, and the blood needs to go in the thresholds of the door of the house. And that's not all. They have to eat the meat of this lamb. You know what's really awful is that they need to eat it inside the house. They need to grill it. They cannot boil it. They have to have all the shape right there. And it doesn't mean that they only eat the good part of the meat. No, they have to eat everything. They have to eat the head. They have to eat the legs. They have to eat the intestines. All night long, they have to eat the whole thing, all the family. If they don't have enough number of people to eat it all, they need to invite another family to come and eat with them. But it's got to be eaten inside the home, every single one of them. You think it was a great barbecue party? Oh, no. I'm sure it was awful. You know, remember going to Mexico when we were invited to this house, and we were in the house, and we saw a lot of these chicken, these hen, walking around. And then soon we got some nice chicken dish brought to us, and we looked outside, and none of the hens were there anymore. And all the team members couldn't eat it because they thought it was so awful that these cute hens or chickens got to be killed for us. And it's the same thing. I mean, was it good? Well, not only that. You know what they had to do? They had to eat this meat with unleavened bread, which is like hopelessly chewy. And in fact, it's not even chewy because the dough's not leavened. It's a horrible food to eat. Plus, bitter herbs. The herbs that you don't like, the bitter ones, the one that you put in your mouth and you want to drink water because it's so bitter. You got to eat it that way. You know what they're doing? They're meditating on the meaning of this sacrifice all night long. By what? Eating it. Did you ever think of this as the meaning of the Lord's Supper? Well, that's exactly what Jesus did. On the day of Passover, Jesus said, "Eat my body, drink my blood. This is what I've done for you." I got to bring this message to close. She did all that she did because Jesus is so wonderful. And Jesus did all that he did because we were so wonderful? Well, I don't think so. But Jesus certainly wanted to make us wonderful. Look at what happens to this woman. Well, what she did will be told in memory of her. The story is absolutely precious because the way it's told is wonderful. Her name does not appear. She is anonymous. We don't know who she is. There are similar stories all over the Gospels. So people think this is this or this is that, but you can never tell. This could have been the same story. It could be a different story. Her name doesn't appear. Mark wants to make sure that her name is anonymous, but at the same time, she is memorialized. Her name, her person, her actions becomes an important memorial to all people. How was she made precious? She was made precious not because of her action. She was made precious because what Jesus has done for her. Because Jesus was the broken alabaster box, pure nard, pure Christ, pure God, emptied himself for us. The question then is, how about us, you and me? You know why gospel is so precious? Because Jesus makes us precious. Because Jesus is so amazingly precious. Jesus died a good death. And our life will emulate this good death. I want to challenge you this week. I want you to think about it. Now as we draw this message to close, how do we glorify Jesus? I think the way we glorify Jesus is whatever we do, it points to the very death and the resurrection of Jesus. We live Christ. To live is Christ. We die with him. We live with him. That's why repentance is so beautiful. That's why your faith is so beautiful. That's why your sacrifice is so beautiful. That's why giving of your life is so beautiful. Doing all that you do, not for the selfish reasons that I mentioned earlier, but for the sake of Jesus and for the others is so beautiful, is because by doing that, you proclaim Jesus. And that's the gospel. As you pour out, you tell the whole world that it's not me that's poured out, it's Jesus who's really poured out. And I am what I am because what he has done for me. This is a very beautiful cycle of godliness. May the Lord bless you and me as we live this out, especially remembering what Christ has done for us this week. May the Lord bless us. Let's pray.